You see something small at the edge of the woods, barely the size of your thumb. It's beautiful, with majestic wings that catch the light. It hovers just out of reach, and something about it, the way it moves, feels like an invitation. You follow it, deeper between the trees. The light changes, different. The way it looks right before a storm that never comes. It leads you somewhere quiet, somewhere still. It settles, finally, close enough to touch. You reach out, and before you know it, you're dead. This is not the fairy you were promised. If you too are beautiful, with majestic wings that catch the light, check out Pantheon, a brand inspired by myths, legends and folklore. We ship worldwide and are rated excellent on Trustpilot. Link in the description. There is no single origin of the fairy. The version most people already know starts in Ireland with a race called the Tuatha Dé Danann, the people of the goddess Danu. In the old texts, they arrive as conquerors, ruling the land with power that looks unmistakably divine. Then they lose. A new people, the Milesians, defeat them in battle, and the Tuatha Dé Danann retreat into the hollow hills and burial mounds that still dot the countryside. Over time, they become closely identified with another name found in the old texts, the Ishi, the people of the mounds. It's a tidy story, gods defeated, driven underground, eventually becoming the fairies of later folklore. It's also one of several explanations scholars have offered, not a settled account everyone agrees on. Some argue that the Tuatha Dé Danann were never gods in the first place, but that reading has a specific origin of its own. The monks who first wrote these stories down were Christian, working centuries after the old religion had been displaced. Turning gods into ancient kings and conquerors was a way of preserving stories without endorsing the beliefs behind them. Whether that's an accurate memory of Ireland's pagan past or a deliberate downgrade performed by the people writing it down is something scholars still argue about today. And Ireland isn't the only source. Cross into Scotland, and the same beings get called by a different name in Scottish Gaelic, Dinyashi, meaning the same thing, people of the mound. Entirely separate beliefs developing alongside all of this too. Germanic and Scandinavian folklore had its own hierarchy of hidden elves and dwarves, distinct traditions through centuries, and later they'd all end up folded into the same broad category. None of them started out calling themselves fairies. That word comes later, layered on top, gradually pulling separate beings under a single label they never asked for. The fairy begins as a category, and it takes centuries to build. The pagan gods become a problem when Christianity began to take over. A new religion had swept through with its own strict cosmology, heaven, hell, angels, demons, one God, one truth. But the old beliefs hadn't vanished from people's daily lives. Fairy mounds still stood in every field. People still left offerings, still avoided certain trees, still told the same stories their grandparents told. Christianity needed somewhere to put all of it. The simplest answer was the one you'd expect. Fallen angels, demons in disguise, tempting the faithful, dragging Christians back toward the old ways. But that answer didn't sit comfortably with everyone. Fairies, by most accounts, weren't purely malicious. They could reward kindness. They could bless a harvest. Calling something that occasionally helped you a demon required some mental gymnastics most writers weren't fully willing to do. A stranger idea existed alongside it. What if, when Lucifer rebelled against heaven and dragged a third of the angels down with him, not every angel picked a side? What if some simply stood still, refusing to fight for either army, too cautious or too indifferent to commit? Medieval theologians had a term for this. Craven angels, too cautious to rebel, too indifferent to fight for God. When the war ended and Lucifer's host was cast down, these angels were judged too, but differently. Not evil enough for hell, not faithful enough for heaven. Sent somewhere else entirely, into an in-between world that belonged to neither. This world became Fairyland. It's a solution that explains almost everything folklore already said about fairies. Why they could be kind one day and cruel the next, why they seemed powerful, even angelic, but never quite holy, why priests couldn't fully condemn them and couldn't forgive them either. Even centuries later, serious Christian thinkers were still turning the same question over. C.S. Lewis cataloguing the medieval explanations he'd studied, listing 4 competing theories side by side without picking a favourite: a third species separate from angels and men, a special lesser class of angel, the spirits of the dead, or simply devils wearing a more charming face. Nobody ever fully settled it. Fairies stayed exactly where medieval theology had left them, caught in the one category Christianity was never fully built to hold. You mark out the corners of where your house will stand with 4 bundles of hazel twigs. Then you leave. In the morning you come back and you check them. 1 bundle has fallen, knocked over or moved or simply gone. You don't build there. You gather your materials and walk to the next field over, because a fallen twig means one thing only: a path runs through this ground and something walks it every night. Build across that path and you won't be the one living in the house for long. This superstition shaped where entire villages stood. Fairy paths were understood to run in straight lines, connecting old forts, ancient mounds, and solitary hawthorn trees. The roads of a population nobody could see, moving between their own landmarks, the same way people moved between theirs. Houses were built with doors left slightly open at night, front and back in line with each other, so that whatever needed to pass through could pass through without being blocked. Homes were built with corners deliberately cut away. Entire extensions were left unbuilt because the straight path a fairy walked didn't bend for a wall. Ignoring this could lead to severe consequences. One recorded account describes a man who cut down a bush along a known fairy path. The wood wouldn't burn. He fell ill soon after and died. Another man, caught walking the same route at the wrong hour of night, was found dead the next morning, in the way, the story says, of something that had no intention of stopping for him. The hawthorn tree specifically was treated with the kind of caution most plants never received. Farmers left it completely untouched. Entire fields ploughed around a single lone tree standing in the middle rather than cleared. All of this came from calling something dangerous by a name gentle enough that it might not notice. The good neighbours, the fair folk, the other crowd. Never the actual word. Speaking it plainly indoors after dark was its own kind of risk, as though naming the thing might be mistaken for an invitation. Milk was left out at night, poured onto doorsteps or into the corners of fields from the same instinct that leaves an offering for anyone capable of taking far more than milk if they went unpaid. Iron was nailed above door frames, driven into the ground at thresholds, kept in pockets when crossing open land, the one substance the good neighbours were said to be unable to bear. In 1999, plans for a new motorway through County Clare ran directly through a lone hawthorn tree standing at what would become Junction 11. A local folklorist led a public campaign to save it. Enough people took the danger seriously enough that the road was rerouted. The bush still stands there today. Traffic bends around it. You wake to your child crying, except something's wrong. Yesterday she was healthy. Tonight she won't feed, won't settle, won't quiet no matter what you do. Her face looks different somehow, thinner, older, in a way that shouldn't be possible in a single night. A neighbour comes to see her. They know what happened. Your child is gone. The thing lying in her place isn't your daughter. They called it a changeling, a child who wouldn't thrive, cried without stopping, ate far more than a baby should, and still never grew. Every one of these was treated as evidence of substitution. The fairies had taken the real child for their own purposes and left something ancient behind, wearing a baby's face. The most famous test for confirming it was almost absurd on purpose. A mother would take a handful of empty eggshells, fill them with water, and set them boiling over the fire as though she were brewing a full meal for a crowd of harvesters. She'd do this in plain view of the suspected child. The idea was that something old enough to be pretending couldn't resist reacting to something so ridiculous, and in the stories it never could. The child would sit up in its cradle and announce its own age without meaning to. I have seen the acorn before the oak, I have seen the egg before the hen, but I have never seen ale brewed in an eggshell before. The moment it spoke, the disguise was finished. In kinder versions of the tale, the changeling simply vanished up the chimney, and the real child was returned to the cradle exactly as it had been taken. The methods used to force that return weren't always so gentle. Iron was placed by the cradle, scissors, poker and nail, the same object said to repel every kind of fairy. Some families held the child near an open fire or over hot coals, believing the pain alone would force the fairies to take the changeling back and return the real child. Others left the child at crossroads or at the base of a fairy mound overnight, hoping that whoever made the change or the trade would come and collect it. These practices were acted on by frightened parents, following the only explanation available to them for a child who suddenly seemed wrong. The belief reached real families past the fireside stories, and it cost some of them everything. You hear music somewhere past the tree line, faint at first, then closer. You follow it toward a clearing you don't remember being there before. A ring of pale mushrooms marks the grass. Inside it, shapes are dancing, beautiful, unhurried, moving like they have nowhere else to be for the rest of time. Something takes your hand. You dance. One song becomes another. You don't feel tired. You don't feel the cold. You don't think even once to check how long you've been busting moves. When you finally step outside the ring, the woods look wrong, overgrown. You walk home and find your house gone, replaced by one you don't recognize. The people inside have never heard your name. You're only dancing for one night. A different version of this warning survives too, dressed up as romance rather than horror. Oisin, a warrior and poet among the Fianna, a legendary band of Irish warriors, meets a woman named Niamh, riding out of the Western Sea on a white horse. She is the daughter of the king Tir Nanor, the land of youth, a realm where nobody sickens, ages or dies. She asks him to come with her. He does. They live there together for what feels like to Oisin like 3 short years. He grows homesick anyway and asks to visit Ireland one final time. Niamh agrees on one condition. He must never let his feet touch Irish soil or he'll never return to her. He rides home on her white horse and finds a country he no longer recognizes. His father is gone. His companions are gone. The halls he grew up in have collapsed into ruin. 300 years have passed in Ireland, though Oisin has aged only by the years he actually felt. While helping a group of strangers to move a boulder, he leans too far from the saddle. The strap breaks, he falls and his feet touch the ground. 300 years catch up with him in an instant. He turns from a warrior in his prime into an old, withered man and dies before he can even finish explaining who he is. Later fairy folklore keeps this same warning, stripped of the romance and the royal otherworld setting. Just an ordinary person led into a fairy ring by music that seemed too beautiful to walk away from, who steps back out to discover that everyone they knew had already grown old or died, waiting for them to come home. Picture a fairy. Now ask yourself where that picture actually came from. There's no distinct definition holding the category together. Broadly, a fairy is anything from the old supernatural landscape that lives just outside human rules, bound to a place, a family, or a task, powerful enough to help or harm, and never fully explained by either religion or science. That's a wide net, wide enough to catch beings that share almost nothing else in common. Take the Dullahan, a headless rider on a black horse carrying his own severed head under one arm, its face split from ear to ear in a grin, its skin the colour and texture of stale dough. He rides at night, calling out a single name before he stops, and whoever's name he speaks dies before morning. There's no reasoning with him, no locking him out. Gates and doors are said to open on their own the moment he approaches. The banshee belongs to similar folklore and looks nothing like him. Sometimes she's a beautiful young woman with long flowing hair, dressed in white or silver, combing her hair with a comb nobody should ever pick up if they find it lying on the ground. Sometimes she's the opposite entirely. An old woman with rags, her face twisted, her hair grey and matted. She wails outside a house once, and that sound alone means someone inside won't survive the week. Then there's the Ekushkya, a water spirit. It appears as a beautiful horse standing by a loch, calm enough to seem tame. Anyone who climbs onto its back finds themselves stuck fast, unable to let go, as the horse sprints into the water and drowns them. Sometimes it takes a human shape instead, a handsome stranger, close enough to be human, to be trusted, right up until it isn't. One fairy kills directly, another fairy only ever gives a warning. A third waits by the water, wearing whatever face will get you closest before it's too late. Go further and the variation only widens. Some accounts describe fairies taller than any human, radiant enough to be mistaken for angels. Others describe something closer to the opposite, small, twisted, closer to a troll under a bridge than anything you'd call lovely. Some move alone, others travel in processions, entire crowds crossing the landscape at once, expecting anyone in their path to get out of the way. No consistency, which raises a real problem if you've ever pictured a fairy yourself, because almost everyone today pictures the same thing. Tiny, female, delicate wings, a creature closer to an insect than anything folklore actually described. That image had to come from somewhere. In 1595, English audiences watching a new play by William Shakespeare see something fairy folklore had never shown them before. Up to that point, no single appearance had come to define the fairy. What Shakespeare changes is the image that would eventually eclipse almost everything that came before. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare's fairies hide inside acorn cups. They wear coats stitched from bat wings. They go to war with bumblebees. Titania instructs her attendants to feed a man on apricots and dewberries, food scaled for something the size of an insect. It's the first time in English literature fairies appear this small, and this immediately harmless. A creature you can hold in your palm has a much harder time being genuinely terrifying, and that appears to be the effect that exactly Shakespeare was going for. Taking a figure that could ruin your life and shrinking it down until it could only ever ruin your afternoon. Other writers picked up the idea fast. A pamphlet published soon after, called Robin Goodfellow, describes fairies outright as harmless spirits, a description the folklore had never offered. Within about 50 years of the play's first performance, Shakespeare's tiny fairy had already become the standard version for most English writers that they reached for. Michael Drayton pushed along the joke even further in a long comic poem called Nymphidia, published in 1627. His fairy court fights wars with cricket head helmets and hornet sting swords, and travels by snail shell coach. The terror is gone completely, and what's left is closer to a children's story. From this point on, two versions of the fairy exist, side by side. One of those two versions was about to become the one everybody remembers. By the middle of the 19th century, the fairy has become fashionable. Painters build entire careers on fairy scenes, elaborate, crowded canvases full of tiny figures hidden among grass blades and flower petals, exhibited in serious galleries to serious critics. One of the most celebrated fairy painters of the age is a man named Richard Dadd. In 1843, Dadd murders his father, convinced during a psychotic episode that the man was the devil in disguise. He spends the rest of his life confined to Bethlem Royal Hospital and later to Broadmoor, both asylums for the criminally insane. He keeps painting there. One of his most famous works, worked on for 9 years inside his cell, depicts a crowded fairy court gathered around a woodsman with his axe raised, waiting for a signal to strike. It's meticulous, strange, and one of the finest fairy paintings ever made. The whimsy on the canvas and the horror behind it in the same man at the same time. The trend outlasts the era that started it. Well into the following century, children's books filled with fairies drawn specifically for young readers, gentle, pretty, harmless, by design. In 1923, an English illustrator named Cicely Mary Barker publishes the first of what will become a series called Flower Fairies. Children modelled from her sister's kindergarten, dressed in costumes and sewed to resemble each flower, wings built from twigs and gauze. Rural communities are still leaving iron by the cradle. Rural families are still avoiding the hawthorn. None of that has stopped happening. It simply stopped being the version most people picture first. Cottingley, West Yorkshire, July 1917. Two cousins come home again with wet shoes and muddy hems. The mothers are tired of asking why. Frances is 9, Elsie is 16. Both give the same answer they always give. They'd been down at Beck playing with fairies. Nobody believes them, so this time Elsie borrows her father's camera. The girls disappear toward the stream. 30 minutes later, they come back triumphant. Elsie's father develops the plate in his dark room that night, half expecting a joke gone wrong. What comes up instead is Frances standing by the little waterfall, watching 4 small winged figures dance in front of her. He laughs it off. His daughter is good at drawing. He assumes that he's looking at something the children made. Nobody else laughs it off for very long. The photograph sits in a drawer for 3 years. A family joke, nothing more. Then a lecture on fairies in Bradford. Then the Theosophical Society. Then a magazine. Then a letter reaches a man named Arthur Conan Doyle. Doyle built an entire career on forensic skepticism, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, the most famous detective fiction. A man whose whole reputation rests on the idea that mysteries have logical explanations if you look closely enough. He looks at the photograph of 2 young girls and a handful of dancing fairies, and instead of finding the seams, he finds exactly what he's hoping to find. He writes about it for a national magazine. He publishes a book defending it. Nobody looking at this photograph in 1917 requires a single word of context. Small figures, delicate builds, wings dancing in front of a child by a stream. Every viewer's mind fills the rest instantly, without hesitation, because 300 years of acorn cups and batwing coats and cricket helmet armies and flower petal children have already built the shape, quietly, generation after generation, until a photograph could simply claim to have caught it. The fairies are paper, cut from illustrations in a children's book, pinned upright in the grass with ordinary hat pins. Skeptics eventually notice something the girls never thought to hide. The fairies' hair is styled exactly the way real young women styled their hair in 1917. Fashionable. Elsie and Frances keep the secret for over 60 years. They're elderly women by the time either of them finally admits to how it was done. By then, it barely matters. The photograph had already proven something no confession could take back. Neverland, 1904. On stage, there's no actress playing Tinkerbell at all. Just a small hand mirror, held offstage, catching light from a powerful lamp, flicking it across the set. A fairy made entirely of a moving spot of brightness. Her voice is a string of small bells shaken from the wings. Everything she says, the audience learns second-hand, filtered through Peter Pan repeating what he claims she's just told him. She's viciously jealous of Wendy, a human girl Peter's brought back to Neverland. In J.M. Barrie's own stage directions for the play, Tinkerbell calls Wendy an ugly girl, pulls her hair, and at one point orders the Lost Boys to shoot her out of the sky. Later, when Captain Cook poisons a drink meant for Peter, Tinkerbell drinks it herself instead. Her light starts to fade. Peter turns to the audience directly and asks them to save her. Clap if you believe in fairies. They do, every night. She survives because a room full of strangers decides to believe hard enough. That's the fairy Barrie actually wrote, a creature capable of real spite, kept alive by nothing more than collective belief, possessive of the one person she's attached to. Nearly 50 years later, Walt Disney adapts the story for screen. Tinkerbell keeps the jealousy, the temper, the flashes of real menace toward Wendy, What she loses is the light and the bells. Disney gives her a body, small, human-shaped, defined with wings now built directly into her design rather than left to the audience's imagination. She's the version that sticks, 6 inches tall, glowing softly, trailing a shower of sparkling dust wherever she flies. An image so completely finished that it becomes almost instantly shorthand for the word fairy itself. The domestication doesn't stop there. Decades later, the character who once ordered another girl shot out of the sky now stars in films made specifically for very young audiences, sold in toy aisles, printed on lunchboxes. By this point, the transformation is complete. Small, glowing, and female. Harmless enough to sell as a toy. In recent years, a strange linguistic shift has started happening across fantasy literature and popular fiction. People have begun drawing a strict line between two words that used to mean the exact same thing. Fairy, in the modern mind, now belongs entirely to Disney, Barker, and the children's nursery walls. Small, decorative, safe. So, to talk about the other thing, the entity that walks out of the fog, the creature bound by ancient contracts, the figure that will take your child or steal 300 years of your life while you dance in a mushroom ring, we had to go back to an older world. The Fae. It's an attempt to undo 300 years of literary shrinking in a single word. A way of saying, not that one, the other one. The one our ancestors were afraid of. We like to think we solved the problem by changing the story. We built a world of concrete and glass, mapped every field with satellite, rerouted rivers, and convinced ourselves that anything we couldn't measure under a microscope simply didn't exist. We shrank the monsters until they could fit inside an acorn cup, pinned them to paper with hat pins, and sold them back to our children as plastic dolls. We made them small because we couldn't live with them being big. But the old landscape never really cared about our books, our plays, our movies. The fairy mounds still sit in the middle of Irish fields, untouched by modern tractors. The front doors of old cottages still line up, back to back, facing empty paths where nothing is supposed to walk. And at Junction 11 in County Clare, high-speed modern traffic still swerves in a wide, deliberate arc around a single crooked hawthorn tree because in the 21st century, nobody in charge was willing to take the risk of cutting it down. We spent hundreds of years telling ourselves we'd domesticated the dark. We rewrote stories, renamed the entities, and convinced ourselves that the woods were empty. But if you find yourself walking alone near the tree line at dusk, and you hear music floating through the grass where no instrument should be, step into the ring. I dare you. We're rolling. And there's a rolling shutter. You see something small at the edge of the woods, barely the size of your thumb. It's beautiful, with majestic wings that catch the light. It hovers just out of reach, and something about it, the way it moves, feels like an invitation. You follow it. Deeper between the trees, the light changes.